whatever it takes to retain power.
Trump is an autocrat, and when an autocrat tells you what he is and what he's going to do, we should believe him. Hello, and welcome back to The Count, co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Emily Galvin Almanza. This is my co-host, Alana Sivan. And the last time we saw you, it was 2 o'clock in the morning on November 4th, and we'd been talking for 7 hours. I would like to say that we've been hibernating since then. It's not true. We, like you, have been clicking refresh on the internet. But it is now November 6th. It is day 4 of vote counting in the 2020 election. And there are absolutely still more votes to be counted, but all signs suggest that Donald Trump will lose the election to Joe Biden, perhaps by a very substantial margin in both the Electoral College and absolutely by a substantial margin in the popular vote. Now, there is a strong possibility that Joe Biden would take 306 Electoral College votes. Biden currently leads in the popular vote by more than 4 million votes, with that lead likely to expand as officials finish counting the mail-in votes across the country. The mail-in votes, of course, as we've been saying on this show, did turn out to lean heavily Democratic. And as expected, we smashed turnout records, which is amazing. And may the American people always continue to smash turnout records. This was the most votes ever cast in an election, more than 140 million ballots cast. Biden has received more votes than any other candidate in history, nearly 74 million votes.
And if you are watching the results coming back on election night, meaning the last day of voting, this might not be exactly how you would have thought it would play out. But if you've been watching us on The Count, you'll know that this was 100% expected. Though it's definitely true, by the way, that Democrats across the board, including Biden, underperformed, at least according to what the polls suggested, we did know that we were going to expect a red mirage followed by a blue shift. And this shift played out in a much slower, painful, and difficult process that I think a lot of us expected. But we knew all along that Democrats had a major advantage when it comes to mail-in ballots. This is something that there are a lot of reasons for that. So we've talked a lot about how Donald Trump has constantly cast doubt on the mail-in process and said that people can't trust it. And he's also been downplaying the severity of COVID-19. And so for that reason, we could expect that his supporters would be more likely to go to crowding polling places in person on the day of election, while Democrats would be most likely to mail in ballots. And by the way, this trend of Democrats mailing in more ballots than Republicans is something that preceded COVID-19, but has been exaggerated by it. And so this shift was predictable. It was something that we knew was going to happen. And anyone wondering how Biden made up those votes in Pennsylvania, for example, let's talk about Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is one of the states that tracks the partisan affiliation of the votes that are, or not of the votes, but of the ballots that are requested for mail-ins. So on election day, Democrats had a 3-to-1 advantage in mail-in ballots, 1.5 million to 500,000. And that's statewide, meaning the advantage was always going to be much higher, for example, in deep blue areas like Philadelphia.
So, Alana, I don't gamble because I hate losing more than I like winning, which makes gambling very unsatisfying for me. But I kind of wish that I'd made some bets on our own predictions, because while it felt like during our election night coverage, we were doing a really good job of covering the red mirage and the blue shift. We knew what to expect. We knew that those early numbers were going to be all Trump voters, and then Democratic ballots were going to pour in. We did not see much of that at all on a lot of other news sources. And one other point that we made, we said that Donald Trump was going to, on election night, declare victory. Now, we were saying it was going to happen sometime between 9 and like 11 p.m. He did wait till 2 a.m., so maybe I would have lost some money if I'd put a bet on that. But I mean, that's still pretty good. We nailed the red mirage, we nailed the blue shift, and we nailed the false declaration of victory on election night. He, of course, held a press conference in the White House where he claimed victory and said there was no way Biden could come back and erase what he did not call the red mirage. We saw the red mirage, he claimed it as victory falsely. Now, over the past few days, of course, also as predicted, his campaign has done exactly what we said they were going to do, which is try to turn that perceived chaos of the Red Mirage into legal challenges and vague threats. The good news is that there wasn't enough chaos. The American people were kind of kept it together too much to allow this to happen. Mm-hmm. But that is, of course, exactly what we predicted and what Trump had denied exactly the day before. He is now trying to shut down the count. He falsely claimed victory. He then sought to throw out millions of legitimate votes under bogus claims of fraud. And this has ended up at this point rearing its head in a hilarious way, because, of course, he is hoping that the late ballots in Arizona will flip Arizona and give him Arizona. He's trying to prevent ballots from being counted in Pennsylvania, where the late ballots are very bad for him. And this has resulted in this hilarious scene where Trump's, what's hilarious is like also like really sad, but Trump supporters are showing up in Michigan chanting, "Stop the vote" or "Stop the count," while they were at the same time chanting, "Count the votes" in Arizona. Let's see that clip.
This is just, I mean, really, again, this shouldn't surprise any of us, because we have seen time and time again that that Donald Trump and Republicans who are his and the Republicans who are his enablers will do everything they can to get their supporters to believe their version of truth. And really what's happening here is his supporters might as well be saying, "Make Trump win," because we have in one situation, they're saying, "Stop the count." And another situation, they're saying, "Keep that count going." And basically what they're saying is, where we're losing, there must be some sort of fraud, because there's no chance that we could lose, because Donald Trump told us that the only way that he could lose is if there was fraud.
And let's remember, Alana, that polling we saw from Data for Progress that showed how many Trump supporters don't even use Fox News as their news source. They get their primary news from Donald Trump himself with absolutely no fact checking. So we can understand why people are doing this.
Absolutely, because he's told them that I'm the only person you can trust in this country, and that's extremely dangerous. And so we've also seen, as a result of this, we've seen Donald Trump's sons and Rudy Giuliani and other key figures in this Trump universe head down to Philadelphia yesterday, where they claim that election observers had been barred from the vote counting operation. And by the way, it is true that observers were at one point kept farther than 6 feet away from vote counters. But Trump election observers and other Republican affiliated partisan election observers had access to the process. And I think, Emily, you found this really great tweet where someone who was in the room and reading from the transcript showed us exactly what happened and saw basically in the courtroom.
Yes. So I don't know the position of the person who tweeted the transcript, but the transcript was hysterical and it gave me flashbacks to my time as a public defender. Essentially, the Trump legal team was claiming that Trump observers had not been given access to the room. And the judge, Paul Diamond, asked the Trump campaign lawyer, "Are your observers in the counting room?" And this lawyer decided to respond with the following statement: "There's a non-zero number of people in the room." So then, of course, the judge, you can't do that to a judge. And the judge said, "I'm asking you, as a member of the bar of this court, meaning I'm going to make a bar complaint about you if you lie, are people representing Donald J. Trump for president, representing the plaintiffs, in that room?" And the Trump campaign lawyer admitted, yes, that they actually were in the room. And Judge Diamond says, "I'm sorry, then what is your problem?" Which is, I think, summing up the way all of us are feeling about the litigation at this point, right? It is baseless and time wasting and totally for show.
Right. And the thing is, though, that none of this is keeping Donald Trump from flailing about and wildly claiming in a press conference yesterday with the same old disingenuous and debunked claims. And so we're going to turn to that press conference, which I'm sure many of you watched, and I'm sorry, we're going to show it to you again. But I think we really need to dissect it and talk about how dangerous it is. Let's play that clip right now.
Good evening. I'd like to provide the American people with an update on our efforts to protect the integrity of our very important 2020 election. If you count the legal votes, I easily win. If you count the illegal votes, they can try to steal the election from us. If you count the votes that came in late, we're looking at them very strongly, but a lot of votes came in late. I've already decisively won many critical states, including massive victories in Florida, Iowa, Indiana, Ohio. To name just a few, we won these and many other victories despite historic election interference from big media, big money, and big tech.
I mean, so here's what really freaks me out about that particular clip. I'm winning easily based on the legal votes, but not if you count the illegal votes. Let's be very, very clear. None of these states have counted anything that's even borderline at this point. Mm-hmm. None of those late ballots that you were hearing about, late arriving ballots that were like postmarked before Election Day, but Louis DeJoy dismantled the post office, so they arrived really late. Those aren't even in contention yet. The only votes that anybody's been reporting on are the like very clearly legal votes.
Right.
So this is a person who is totally untethered from reality at this point. And as we've seen in numerous tweets and reports out of the White House, and now like in legal briefing, Trump has no plans to concede. Even if he has no remaining paths to victory, we're going to be in this very uncomfortable position of watching the autocrat flail and refuse to go. This is not just fringe conspiracy stuff that he's throwing out as red meat to his most diehard supporters. He's not just trying to get himself a radio show. Like GOP senators are getting in Trump's corner to amplify the narrative that he was somehow cheated. When, of course, what's happening is that his own plan to cheat didn't work. It's crumbling around him. We're watching him execute literally every single part of his plan and seeing it fail in front of him. Ted Cruz, for example, went on Fox News last night to say that Trump was right to be angry, suggesting that the president had been cheated somehow in Philadelphia. And here is Senator Lindsey Graham, top toady, yesterday on Fox News, saying that, and this is the frightening quote, everything should be on the table for Trump, including, and this is actually the thing that started our show, he brings up the idea that Pennsylvania's GOP-controlled legislature should undermine the will of their own voters, throw out the votes, and put the state's support behind Trump instead of Biden, sending Trump electors instead of Biden. Let's watch what Lindsey Graham has to say about that.
You're a lawyer also, Senator. We're hearing report after report. Election law is clear. It is clear that partisan observers can be there for the vote count. They're being denied access.
Yes, right.
Now, if that part of the election law is violated, now we also know that the Constitution allows state legislators to serve, they're the ones that would make decisions. Should these Republican lawmakers in Pennsylvania and elsewhere, if there's corruption in the law, they don't abide by the law and they don't allow observers in as the law calls for, should they then invalidate this?
I think everything should be on the table. So there's the process of observing an election that's being violated. Philadelphia elections are crooked as a snake. Why are they shutting people out? Because they don't want people to see what they're doing. But
so let's break down exactly what happened here, because being completely transparent, this is an attempt to, just like you said, Emily, throw out people's votes. And not throw out people's votes because there's anything wrong with those votes, but simply throw out those votes because Lindsey Graham and Donald Trump don't like them. And let's back up to talk a little bit about exactly how he would do that. So back to sort of the basics about the Electoral College. The people who vote in elections, all of us, when we're voting, we might check Biden, Harris, Trump. But when we do that, we're voting for that candidate's electors, their slate of electors who, if that person gets the most votes, that slate of electors is to be certified and sent to vote in the Electoral College for the candidate who they are slated to vote for. And so in this election, we're seeing that Biden's slate of electors are likely going to be the ones who will be certified to vote in the Electoral College. And why is that? Because more people voted for them. And so right now, what Lindsey Graham is saying is that, no, instead, I think that the GOP legislature should send a different fraudulent slate of electors to cast their vote in the Electoral College for Donald Trump. And what he is justifying this based off of is this made-up claim of problems in poll observing, which we know are just not true. And so, and not only that, we see that Trump's oldest son, Donald Trump Jr., also appeared to endorse this same plot when conservative commentator Mark Levin tweeted about it. And so by the time Graham said this, the leader of the state Senate, we're very happy about this, said that there was no way that that's something that they would do in Pennsylvania. In fact, he even said that it was prohibited by law. And this is really interesting to hear because it's something that if you've been watching our show, Emily and I have talked a lot and sort of have grappled and gone back and forth as to whether or not we thought GOP legislatures would go along with this plan. And it's good to hear that at this point, they're refusing to do so. And you'll hear us talk a little bit about this later, but that's a check plus for our democracy. But Graham still is refusing to dodge and pretty much said that stealing the election should be on the table. He is saying that Trump should consider that as a real option.
Alana, before we go to the next, I just want to toss in one other thing about that I saw, and that I hadn't seen this in the Hannity clip the last time we watched it, and I just noticed this thing, which is you and I have talked so much about how what's necessary to make that plan work is chaos, right? Mm-hmm. You can only go to the legislature and say, y'all better just appoint Trump electors because we don't know who won the election. If there was so much chaos that they can say we don't know who won the election. Hannity is like feeding Graham this reach of like, because there were no observers in the room, which there were, that means the whole election is invalid. I mean, that is not in any way the kind of chaos that the Trump campaign was relying on and planning for to make this. That is like the Hail Mary of Hail Marys invented by Sean Hannity, which Lindsey Graham is like, yeah, sure, totally, let's do that. I mean, right. It is pants on head lunacy.
Absolutely. And what's even more so is that, before this came on, because lately I've been watching these shows. Why? I don't know. Tucker Carlson made the statement that the people counting the votes in Pennsylvania have an obligation and have the burden to prove that they are not corrupt. As if like we should just come in with the assumption that every single person counting votes is going to fake ballots or is going to engage in some sort of corrupt behavior. And again, that's super dangerous because it's super dangerous, and it also does exactly what Trump wants it to do, which is create chaos. It creates a seed of distrust in every single vote that's being counted for really no reason. And so we see that conservatives aren't taking this well. Well, Trump's conservatives aren't taking this very well, and it's a dangerous, dangerous thing. We also saw on the Fox Business channel yesterday, for example, that Lou Dobbs nearly had a meltdown while grilling Trump's former acting director of national intelligence about why Trump and the Republicans weren't just sending out the Department of Justice to interfere in this election.
Where in the hell are Mitch McConnell? Where is the Republican Party? Where is Ronna McDaniel? Where aren't they out? Why isn't the Republican Party en masse demanding the Department of Justice move in here? It's been absent for the entire process. Can you give us an answer to that?
Look, Look, what I can say is some of those individuals that you just mentioned have absolutely reached out and said, what can we do, and are fully involved.
I'm not asking for little sweetheart letters. I'm asking, why aren't they demanding the Department of Justice step into a political crime?
So again, invented crime that did not actually happen, as the lawyers admitted to the judge. Anyway, so making this situation, like the cherry on top of this sundae, was this lady saying the quiet part as loud as she possibly could. A Trump campaign legal advisor also spoke with Dobbs and was amazingly transparent about how their legal strategy essentially amounts to: we put 3 justices on the Supreme Court. They should totally do whatever we want, especially Amy Coney Barrett. You think I'm exaggerating now, but please watch this clip because I did not exaggerate at all.
And meanwhile, we're waiting for the United States Supreme Court, of which the president has nominated 3 justices to step in and do something. And hopefully Amy Coney Barrett will come through and pick it up. There's no guarantee of that, Lou. So we have to fight this on the ground and make sure that we challenge in every place we are.
Like, she just says it. Hopefully Amy Coney Barrett will come through. Now, I don't know anything about Amy Coney Barrett. It is probably hard for me to adequately relate to her. But as a lawyer, as a woman, as a lawyer, my God, if I were ever appointed to the Supreme Court and a legal advisor to the president who appointed me, who was involved in like endless conflict, said, I hope she'll come through. I mean, it's the very team that appointed her doing their best to completely undermine her legitimacy. Like, whatever shred of legitimacy is left, the very people who appointed her are lighting it on fire right now.
Mm-hmm. But none of this is a surprise. We knew that this is exactly how they would act. And we knew that this was an expectation for Amy Coney Barrett. I mean, we remember. Exactly. We remember during her hearings how she refused to basically answer simple questions about things that the president could and could not do.
Yeah.
And that's because she wants to leave that door open for him. And I hope, I hope she preserves a shred of dignity if this reaches its way to the Supreme Court and doesn't do his bidding, and acts like maybe this is the one time I'll say this, but acts the way that the GOP legislature acted in Pennsylvania, and in saying that, listen, our democracy is more important than any party. And so, it's when we see Lindsey Graham saying effectively that Trump needs to cheat, that Trump needs to explore fraudulent options, that's something that courts need to step in, that if courts are called on to make a decision, they need to preserve democracy over loyalty to the people that appointed them.
Well, see, Alana, it's really interesting to me because I agree with you. And I actually think that if the GOP appointees on the Supreme Court are playing the long game, they've really got to cut and run from Trump, because anything they do to help Trump at this point so completely undermines the legitimacy of the court. Like, I suspect, like the GOP legislators in Pennsylvania, this would be a bridge too far. Yeah. I hope I'm right about that. But his expectation and his ability to overtly state his expectation is shocking to me. And also, I gotta say, Lindsey Graham and Ted Cruz, like, I don't hold those guys to a real high standard. But it makes me think of, I'm sure you remember this as a public defender. There's like roughly 2 categories of prosecutors. There's the prosecutors who have actually retained some sort of human functionality. And when they are asked to do something truly ridiculous, like, prosecute a 98-pound woman for kicking her 250-pound abusive husband in the shins, like something like that, right? There's the ones who look at that, they're like, I'm not going to do that. I've retained my own sense of human dignity, ethics, and a moral compass. But so many of them will just do anything because it is the job. And I sort of feel like that's where Lindsey Graham and Ted Cruz and like the other Trump toadies at this point, where their head is at, is they've just like internalized this authoritarian structure where they will say anything, no matter how ridiculous, because they see it as their job. And it's really weird to watch now in a moment where it feels like the rest of the country is recoiling. Even the media that cut away from Trump's speech last night. Like, we're in a different world in terms of the way people are treating Donald Trump. Watching the folks that haven't yet caught up to that is some mixture of tragic and infuriating.
Mm-hmm. And especially now that we're not quite in the clear yet. I have no hope that Trump will concede in this election.
No.
None at all. In fact, he's flat out said that he's not going to concede.
Did he ever think? Is he like? Can he form the words of concession? Like, I don't know.
He can't do it. And listen, we've joked about the scenario where he'll be barricading the doors of the Oval Office.
A chifferobe will go in front of the door. Yes,
exactly. I really think that could happen at this point. But at least the media is being super honest about it for the most part, and making sure that they're not perpetuating his lies. But again, there's a lot of work to do from now until Inauguration Day. And so the big concern looking forward is how far Trump will take this.
And all the bad things he could do in between too. I mean,
absolutely. And specifically, we have to think about how we're going to respond, because this is we're approaching dangerous territory. We are approaching a complete threat to our democracy. We're dealing with an autocrat, and that's something we've said a lot on this show. And so to talk a little bit more about that, I spoke with a very special guest earlier today who is an expert on autocrats. So I'm going to play that clip for all of you, and then we'll talk about it afterwards and wrap things up. Let's play that. We are here today with Maria Stephan, a renowned political scientist whose work has focused on the role of civil resistance and nonviolent movements in advancing human rights, democratic reforms, and peace. She is the co-author of Why Civil Resistance Works, the Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict, and a variety of other works on the conflict between authoritarianism and democracy around the world. We've seen that Trump and his campaign have so far refused to acknowledge that Biden's victory is legitimate. We're seeing signs out of the White House that suggest that Trump will continue to push to challenge the results of this election, and he's making baseless claims that voting was tainted by fraud and by corruption. And so when we are looking at everything that's happening right now, Maria, thank you for joining us. And the first question I have for you today is he simply delaying the inevitable?
I think he is. And thanks, Alana. It's a pleasure to be with you and the Count. I think Trump at this point is delaying the inevitable. And what is remarkable is that Americans have shown up in unprecedented numbers in the wake of a devastating pandemic, economic crisis, multiple intentional barriers to participation, and they have overwhelmingly chosen Biden and Harris to be the next president and vice president. And so, people have been demanding that all votes be counted, and now they're demanding that the voters decide the results of the election. So I think he knows he's losing, and he's losing badly, and he's going to do whatever he can in an attempt to try to stay in power, but it's not going to work.
And what's interesting is that this is, and something we've talked a lot about on this show, is how we have to believe an autocrat when he tells us what he's going to do. And this is something he's been really telling us that he's going to do, that he was going to do for quite some time. He said he's repeatedly undermined integrity of our elections. He's made all of these sorts of baseless claims about the validity of mail-in ballots. And he's also said that he was hoping for the Supreme Court to bail him out. So you are somebody who has studied autocrats around the world. So can you talk to us a little bit about how his behavior lines up with some of the autocrats you've seen in other countries?
Sure. Trump is acting in very predictable ways compared to other autocrats and autocratic wannabes around the world. And all autocrats want you to believe that they call the shots, that they determine the truth, and that ordinary people are powerless to determine the outcomes. And we've been seeing this now for years. The attempts to delegitimize the media, the attempt to attack people who are opposing or on the opposition, to criminalize dissent, to humiliate other people. We've seen a hollowing out of some normal checks on executive power in key institutions. So all of the, things that we have seen in other places around the world have certainly been part of Trump and his enablers, checklist. But again, they want you to believe that ordinary people are powerless. But what we're seeing now across this country, and what I think we're going to be seeing, in the next days and weeks, is that people are going to, speak out loudly, clearly, and take action to ensure that their voices are heard. And we've seen this in so many pro-democracy movements around the world, whether it's in, Sudan, the Gambia, Ukraine, Serbia, the Philippines, Poland, all of these places where you had, autocrats or would-be autocrats attempt to undermine democracy and attempts to steal elections. And people have organized, mobilized, and used powerful nonviolent means, to uphold democracy in these countries. And I expect no different in this country.
It was really interesting to hear you use the word wannabe autocrats. So talk to us a little bit more about that. So specifically, why is Trump a wannabe autocrat? And I think you answered it a little bit already, but sort of asking to delve deep into it. So you described him as a wannabe autocrat. What is preventing him from being a full-out Putin, basically?
Yeah, I think what is he definitely exhibits all the signs and inclinations of autocrats and authoritarians. I think what is noteworthy in this country is that we have strong institutions, a strong rule of law, not perfect by any means, and there certainly have been cracks. But we have checks on authority, and probably the biggest check is civil society. And so, in what we don't see in this country, are large numbers of people being rounded up merely for going out and protesting. There have been attacks, there's been, harassment, intimidation, but you don't quite see the same level of, mass repression that you would see in other kind of authoritarian states around the world. But at the same time, autocratic behavior takes many different forms, and going after institutions, spreading misinformation, attacking the press. These are all classic moves by autocrats and autocratic wannabes. So it matters less whether he fits the definition of an autocrat, and more, he's trying to do what all autocrats around the world want to do. And, it's up to institutions and the people to prevent that from happening.
So you've talked a lot about how our institutions are things that could save us potentially, and could potentially prevent Trump from carrying out this plan to subvert democracy. I'm curious to hear your opinion on sort of how those institutions are doing right now, and if there are any ways that we should be worried about, how certain institutions might handle this, like the courts.
Mm-hmm. Well, institutions like the courts, like legislatures, are the foundation of our democracy in many ways. And we look to institutions to ensure that our basic rights and freedoms are protected. At the same time, we can't just rely on institutions alone. We have to rely on ourselves and ordinary people to ensure that rights, freedoms are protected and that our democracy is upheld. And I think this is what this election period is showing, is that
it's going to take all of us. It's going to take the courage and determination of election officials who right now I think are the unsung heroes and are doing remarkable work to ensure that every valid vote is counted, legitimizing these ballots, and, you know, in a very impartial, independent way, you know, calling, certifying the votes at this time. And so they are playing such a critically important role in upholding the integrity of this election. And, you know, I think till now we've seen an attempt to suggest that legislatures could attempt to submit alternative slates of electors to Congress, meaning in defiance of the popular will. And so far we've seen, for example, the Republican head of the Pennsylvania state legislature say that no, in fact, we are not going to submit a slate of electors that goes against the will of the people. So these kinds of statements are critically important to upholding democracy in this moment. And, you know, we've also seen cracks and fissures. We've seen, you know, legal cases, courts rule that certain votes cannot be counted. We've seen attempts to prevent ordinary Americans from voting in the election. And this is unconscionable. And I think this is where we see the weakness of some of these institutions. But all in all, and especially a huge shout out to the work that's being done right now by state and local election officials to ensure that we have a free and fair election.
I'm really glad you mentioned that about Pennsylvania, because I think a lot of what we've been doing on this show as well has been wondering, will they or won't they? And I think a lot of us were actually Emily and I particularly were very skeptical of whether or not we were going to have a Republican legislature stand up to this idea of sending a fraudulent slate of electors. So we're really happy to hear that they're not going to do that. And that's a point for democracy right there.
Exactly.
So talk to us about what the people need to be doing right now. Like, you've talked a lot about what local legislatures should be doing, what people in other countries have done. How do we engage in civil resistance in a way that prevents Trump from essentially, you know, staging a coup on our country?
Yeah, well, I think the most important thing right now, and what we've seen been happening across the country, is for voters, ordinary Americans, to continue to reiterate the message that all votes must be counted and the results must reflect the will of voters. I think that is the central message. And we've seen, you know, joyful rallies taking place across the country, you know, that began on election night and have continued to the present, just to, you know, celebrate democracy and to send a message to officials and politicians that we are going to hold you accountable for ensuring that all votes are counted and to respect the results of the election. And so, I mean, I think, you know, continuing to highlight the good actions that are being taken, the responsible actions that are being taken by elected officials and others. And so highlighting the positive and celebrating it, I think, is really important. And in places where we see attempts to cross red lines or to, you know, violate, you know, sacred principles of respecting the will of voters, we need to have, you know, different actions. And, you know, we've seen, you know, different forms of mobilization. We've seen branches of the AFL-CIO say that if there is an attempt to subvert the election, we will consider actions to participate in a nationwide strike. And so, you know, if there are more kind of overt attempts to thwart the election in the will of voters, then that is, you know, would be a time for more intensified civic action on the part of all different kinds of groups: organized labor, religious leaders and institutions, businesses, which are a critical economic pillar, athletes and artists who have played such an outspoken role for democracy in this period. So it's going to take, you know, all voices from all different parts of society to say that, no, we voted, we decided, and, you know, we are going to ensure that the government sworn in is of, by, and for the people.
And it seems like these efforts are actually going to be really necessary. You know, we just heard a few moments ago Donald Trump saying that he's not conceding. And so we legitimately could, not legitimately isn't the right word, but actually could be looking at a world where we have Trump throwing a tantrum instead of allowing for a peaceful transfer of power. If that's what we end up seeing, which to me looks pretty likely, what do you think that says about our democracy?
I mean, I think Trump is going to have a tantrum no matter what. And so then it's going to just come down to, what actually takes place, the actions. And is he going to have a base of support and enablers who allow him to engage in harmful or illegal, unconstitutional behavior? So we may not even see a concession speech at a certain point, but it's going to come down to, people from different pillars, including within government, within labor, within businesses, within faith communities, saying we will not accept illegitimate results of this election. We're just not going to go along with it. And that's what we know about all kind of authoritarian and autocratic wannabe leaders, is that they all ultimately depend on the consent and cooperation of ordinary people, whether it's bureaucrats, whether it's workers, whether it's business people. These are the people that provide them with power. And when we take it away, they have no power. And so at the end of the day, this is why ordinary people and their ability to organize and mobilize is, I think, what is going to be decisive.
Definitely. And I think on the flip side of that, when you're talking about Trump's enablers and supporters, I've been seeing all over different examples of supporters engaging in intimidation, sort of right-wing groups, for example, coming from Virginia to Pennsylvania to engage in that sort of intimidation. How is that something that local elected should be responding to? How is that something the media should be responding to? And how can we address this sort of right-wing attack on democracy?
Sure. I mean, I think it's critically important for elected officials, for, law enforcement agents to speak out against illegal, unlawful armed groups, far-right militias, which we know are illegal and unconstitutional. And they need to say that plainly. And also to speak out in support of First Amendment rights. Like, people have a constitutional right to peacefully protest. And protest has been core to American identity for generations, is responsible for almost all of the positive gains we've had, from abolishing slavery to, civil rights, to suffrage, to, ensuring protection for workers at the workplace. Like, all of these important gains have been brought about through mass civic action. And I think it's so incumbent upon elected officials to acknowledge that and to recognize and support the right to peacefully protest and assemble, and at the same time take action against these unlawful, violent groups that are trying to, threaten, harass, and intimidate ordinary people.
And it seems to me like there's a key role potentially in some areas for police to play in that. So, for example, to not sort of add flame to protests. And that's something that I'll be interested to see how different police departments respond to that throughout the country. So I'm also curious to hear from you how you see this playing out. What are the worst case scenarios? What are the best case scenarios? What's happening? What's happening in the future for this country and for this election?
Sure. I mean, I think the worst case scenario is, continued insistence by Trump and other GOP influencers that the election was rigged or stolen, and continuing to peddle this message, which inflames the sentiments of base supporters, encourages violence, and like this, giving sanction to these far-right groups to go out and to intimidate and harm, people who may be protesting or out celebrating democracy, is definitely deeply, deeply concerning. And I think this is, a big risk in this moment, which is why it's so important for Republicans, especially in this moment, to take the side of democracy and to say enough is enough. and we acknowledge the results of this election and respect the will of the people. I think those statements, and also by religious leaders, evangelical leaders, those who have strong followings, I think now is the time to come out on the side of democracy. So I think that's kind of a worst case scenario, is just increasing tensions, unrest, potential violence happening in different places. And I think the best case scenario is, that Biden and Harris are declared the winners of this election, and there is resounding support from leaders from all different sectors of this society that say, yes, that is the outcome. That is what the American people decided, and it's time to accept it and move on together as a country to face the challenges that so many Americans are facing, whether it's the COVID pandemic, economic crisis. It's time to move on as a country.
Let's hope that that's the result that we get. Maria, thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure, and best of luck in the weeks to come.
Thank you so much, Alana.
So there are so many, that was such a great conversation with Maria, and a lot of things really stuck out to me as she spoke. The first was the need for civil resistance in all different sorts of ways. And she sort of talked about it, both institutional resistance and civil resistance. So when it comes to institutional resistance, seeing state and local electeds do the right thing, no matter what party that they're on, to preserve our democracy. And also talking about how businesses can engage in that sort of resistance as well, in addition to ordinary people. And something that she spoke to as well was sort of like joyful resistance, the celebration of having Joe Biden be decided, the finality of having Joe Biden being the winner in this race. And we've seen those sorts of celebrations happen across the country right now. We've seen it in Philadelphia. There's actually one happening in New York tonight. So I thought all of that was really good to hear. And it was really good to hear sort of her faith in our democracy and her faith in both the people in this country and also in our institutions, which I think has been a nice counterpoint to sort of the pessimism that you and I have had on this show.
Absolutely. I mean, I think joyful resistance is such a nice way to think about it, because it's also a joyful affirmation of the will of the American people. And, part of me thinking, for example, about how media outlets have still not called this election, whose outcome seems at this point pretty inevitable. But it's also a beautiful thing, because we're seeing the votes get counted. We're seeing the work of organizers and activists and grassroots, folks come to fruition in a way which is our institutions finally ignoring the chaos agents.
Mm-hmm.
And that does not mean that we can no longer be on our toes. That's something, Alana, I was thinking about a lot last night, which is like the level of energy and engagement that people have had for the last 6 weeks, ourselves included. Like, that's the level of energy and engagement we have to maintain. Yes, we would have had to maintain it if Donald Trump won was getting traction in his plan to steal the election. But even under a Biden administration, that's the level of energy that folks who want to advocate for change in a wide variety of ways need to maintain. And it's exciting to me to see how effective so far that has been, the potential it holds for the weeks to come. I think that we absolutely can expect Donald Trump to pull, hijinks every chance he gets, but that joyful resistance has the power to carry us into futures that I have not even wanted to imagine. I haven't wanted to tempt fate by imagining like meaningful action on climate change. I haven't wanted to tempt fate by imagining like meaningful transformation of the way we police people and the way we address transgression, or, how families get healthcare. Like that, I feel like that conversation that you just had was about Trump, but it was also about so much more in the way communities can fight for, the future that they want.
And I think if these past 4 years have taught us anything, it's brought to light the weaknesses in our country. It's brought to light the deep-seated roots of voter suppression and how those can be even maxed out more to further disenfranchise people who are Black and brown. It's taught us the ease with which a dictator, essentially, or a dictator wannabe, can work to harm the lives of people who are trying to come to this country, harm the lives of people who are LGBTQIA+. And I think for all of those reasons, once we see this next administration, the next administration needs to not only course correct all of the damage that has been done in these 4 years, but they have to take a real hard look at the conditions that brought these 4 years upon us, and have to work to make sure that something like this never happens again. Because these 4 years were a real threat to so many people, to the lives of so many people, to our next generation, and to the very fabric of our democratic institution themselves. So
people died. People died for this stress test of our nation. A lot of people died. The last 4 years were a very, very, very heavy price to pay, and we have no idea what could happen between now and the end of January.
And we don't know, I mean, I hate to say this, but we don't know what will happen after the next 4 years. So this administration needs to be prepared for that.
Yeah, like I said, keeping up the energy so that, the chaos agents and the fascism fans don't come back, meaner and emboldened in 2024.
But this is all good news, just like you're saying, keeping the energy up. We see media is reporting on this properly. We're seeing that we're seeing so many people, even people in the GOP, who are standing up and doing the right thing right now.
Yeah.
And it's going to take a lot of work to continue having a country of leaders who will do the right thing. But that requires all of us.
It does. Well, that's a very nice note to end on, our call to action, our ongoing call to action. We don't know if the count will remain necessary. So we're going to play it by ear at this point. We will probably dip in to inform you if we are needed, and hope that we are not needed, except for to continue our behind the scenes work of encouraging people to get involved and stay loud in their community. So it has been a pleasure talking with you all. We wish you the best of luck. We wish you a little bit of rest over the weekend, maybe. And some rest next week. This has been The Count. I'm Emily Galvin Almanza. This is Alana Sivan. Thank you so much for joining.